Okay, well, thank you very much for everybody's attention, i.e. attending this presentation. As a bit of background to the presentation and the speaker, last summer we met Irvin and his wife Susan Tanner at a picnic. She was talking to a few people casually, and we didn't want to interrupt the presentation, the talking. So Irvin and I began to have our own casual conversation. It was at this point that I began to have a suspicion that he had something that he could offer us in the way of things that we weren't doing with our organization. So he provided a quick summary of his social science history in the policing world, consequences of penalties imposed on those charged with their actions, and the impacts of crimes on victims. With this introduction to his areas of expertise and experiences, I inquired if he would undertake a Cacor presentation about his work with the aim of stimulating a Q&A session about societal consequences of increasing global ecological failures. And so with that brief introduction, there's a good deal of information on his biography and a description of the presentation. But I'm just going to sort of say to you, Irvin, the floor is yours, and go ahead. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
So I'm going to talk to the title of Persuading Politicians to Halve Violent Crime Within 5 Years. And as we go through, I will throw out a few ideas that might be lessons for Cacor. Although I'm married to an environmentalist, what I know about is trying to change policies on crime. So here we go. Basically, where I come from is a series of books that have been written about the rights of crime victims and what can be done to prevent people being crime victims. And the latest book is called The Science and Secrets of Ending Violent Crime. And yes, it starts with the impact of violent crime on victims, but it does three things, which I'm going to be sharing with you today. First of all, it looks at what are the proven ways to reduce street and gender-based violence. Secondly, what are the essentials for getting that implemented at a national level in Canada or at a city level in the city of Ottawa? And lastly, I'm going to be sharing what I call the secrets to building political will to get these solutions used widely enough to actually reduce violent crime, street violence, gender-based violence by 50% within the next 3 to 5 years across Canada, at one level, and also across the city of Ottawa. So the conclusion is going to be that if you want to reduce violent crime by 50%, which is what I want to do and people who I collaborate with want to do, you've really got to look at 4 different ways to build the political will to make it happen. The first is you have to articulate a compelling case. Basically, we live in the 19th century where it was thought that the best way to deal with crime was to somehow catch the offender, convict him in a criminal court, and punish him. There was no talk about victims or reducing harm or anything like that. So a key part of the compelling case for the shift is actually not to argue against propaganda, the police telling you that you're going to be a victim of a horrible crime tomorrow unless you increase their budget. It is to get the decision makers to focus on how to save lives, how to protect women and children, particularly from gender-based violence, how to reduce the trauma from crime, and how to decrease fear. So we're going to be looking at that. I'm going to unpack that a little bit more. A second thing that is really important to this is to actually have professionally qualified planners who work within agencies, within government in particular. And we, of course, don't have that in Canada. We don't have that in Ottawa, but that's very important because they are able to articulate the case to decision makers of actually any political vision to actually do the things that will reduce violence. The other group is to raise awareness, and I have been using the UN, and UN has been using me, and that's a very key player in bringing about change. We also have to engage in e-marketing. No company today goes without an e-marketing team to sell their product. So if you want to change the culture, you have to use e-marketing. And for people in Generation Z or even millennials, this is obvious. For people of our generation, this is not so obvious often because we don't have the tools. And yes, you can use traditional media, but you have to really know how to work with journalists. And we need to see stuff done in university courses. I'm very struck from what I know from Susan that York University basically has the only environmental program that is about making change. And we're in the city of Ottawa, where the University of Ottawa and the University of Carleton have really just not got on board yet. Then there are also mechanisms for policy transformation, of which the most important in Canada is an organization called Safer Cities. It's now called the Canadian Centre for Safer Communities. And I'll talk about parliamentary committees and I'll talk about other lobby groups. So that's where we're going to end up. So I'm going to give you some very quick highlights of what's going on in Canada in relation to crime. So if you look at violent crime recorded by the police, you have to remember that only about 25% of victims of violent crime actually call the police. I'll talk to that in a moment. But what the media use and what people like Poilievre and Trudeau use and Ford uses are police data. And basically, this is from 2000 to today. If you went back an earlier 10 or 15 years, it would have been coming down almost in a straight line. And then around 2015, it started going back up. So when Poilievre says he is blaming the Liberals for violent crime going up, blaming the Liberals is probably correct. But what he's planning to do is probably irrelevant, false, and harmful. But whatever is going on, violent crime is in fact going up. Just a little bit internationally, because we live just above the United States. This is maybe a complicated chart for some of you, but I think most of you are very numerate. If you look at the number of homicides per 100,000, the US, at the time I did this chart, was just above 5. Actually, during COVID, it went quite close to 7. And if you look at Canada, we are around 2, and we are the highest of the other G7 countries, but way below the United States. If you look on the right there, you see the second column gives you the incarceration rates, and the US is at over 600 per 100,000. That's roughly 2 million people incarcerated on an average day, and we are around 100. And you'll basically see that the United States is an outlier. It is actually has the highest incarceration rate anywhere in the world, and Louisiana is gets the Oscar for its incarceration rates and actually for its homicide rates. Now, I'm not going to focus on the rest of that table, but if you have a very high incarceration rate, you do get economies of scale, but you're spending a huge amount of money on incarceration. And I'm going to be talking about where you could be spending that money. And in fact, the Biden administration is beginning to do some of these things. So this is Canada. It basically shows that between 2000 and 2010, the cost of an average cop in Canada went up in constant dollars by 50%. And that is a huge increase. We basically went from cops who were close to the average income to cops who are well above the average income, and that's before overtime. The actual salaries have not increased that much since then. They go up with inflation. But this means that municipalities who pay for 2/3 of policing are putting a lot of money now into policing that they didn't do before. I'm going to skip this, but what it basically shows is that policing has gone up way more than any of the actual investments that would reduce crime. This is also a little bit complicated, but basically the proportion of people reporting violence to the police in 93 was almost double what it is today. So while the costs of policing have been going up, people are generally, particularly for violent crime, reporting less to the police. So whatever they do, they're getting less popular, although in Canada, policing is incredibly popular compared to any other country. It's not an accident that it's a Mountie that's our icon. This is also a complicated chart, but it's just to remind you that even if you report the crime to the police, they don't necessarily record it, and only a small proportion of those crimes recorded actually lead to an arrest, and only a small of those number of those lead to a conviction. So basically, this system of paying for police and courts and prisons is limited in its ability to succeed. This is actually one of my favorite charts. Chicago and Toronto, two cities of almost identical population. Actually, Chicago is shrinking and Toronto is growing. Chicago has 13,000 cops, Toronto 5,500. The incarceration rate in Illinois is close to 6 times that of Ontario. The homicides in Chicago are 10 times those of Toronto. So anybody who seriously thinks that you can solve the crime problem by adding more police or by paying them more, you're defying incredible evidence. And this is only an illustration of that evidence. You can do the same analysis across US states, across Canadian provinces, and actually across the, I would call it the civilized world, where you can actually count, get reliable counts of the number of police or the incarceration rates. So anybody like Poilievre who comes in saying, oh, well, I'm going to bring back mandatory minimum penalties, I'm going to increase the penalties, all he's doing is increasing the cost to the taxpayer and, yeah, the cost to those offenders who get caught, but he's not going to make anybody safer in reality or feel safer. So I'm going to show you a 2-minute video. This is a video that I use to build political will in Canada. I've used it with city councillors from coast to coast, not every city. And I've also used it with the Premier of BC. I also use it on social media, on both LinkedIn and Twitter. And you're going to find the bullets hard to follow. I just want you to get the main message. And we will then look, I will then unpack those slides. So here you go.
Violent crime harms more than 1 in 15 people each year in Canada.
Prevention focused on the root causes of violent crime is proven to reduce violence significantly, cost-effectively, and within 5 years.
Social outreach to those most vulnerable prevents violence.
Youth development programs in high-violence neighborhoods prevents violence.
Trauma therapy and mentoring with job training and sports prevents violence.
Positive parenting and addressing negative social norms prevents violence.
Governments in Canada must commit to preventing violence with a violence reduction office, sustained investment, and strong planners.
Cities that plan smartly can and have reduced violence by 50% or more within a few years. To halve violence in 5 years, Canada must invest now in 3 new ways to harness proven solutions.
Establish a high-level office for violence prevention to lead change and achieve less violence.
Train community safety planners, develop safety planning tools, and foster learning from success.
Invest sustained funding in smart prevention that is adequate to achieve significant reductions. We have the knowledge and practice to save lives, stop trauma, and help people feel safe from crime. Thoughts and prayers are not enough. We deserve smart and affordable investments in violence prevention now to end violent crime.
So that is an example of a tool that we developed to build political will. And we've used it to get city councillors to think. It takes 2 minutes. And then to go on with a conversation about what they can actually do. So I'm going to give you a little bit of that conversation. The difference between our talk today and a talk with city councillors is typically you get half an hour with the Premier of BC or a city councillor, and they will interrupt and ask questions. So I'm going to forestall some of those questions by giving you a little bit more detail as we go through. And when we get to Q&A, you can ask some more, you can challenge or whatever. So the first thing that is important about violent crime is it's incredibly concentrated. So you would probably go to Chicago, and you would certainly go to Toronto. You probably wouldn't go to Jane Finch in Toronto, and you wouldn't go to similar areas in Chicago. This is actually Winnipeg, and the dark blue are the high violence areas in Winnipeg. Those are areas we know a lot about, and this is StatsCan data. They have lower income, higher unemployment, fewer people completing high school, more Aboriginal people. Now, that's what we're faced with, and we're not going to be able to eliminate poverty or unemployment overnight. So what is it that can be achieved within as little as 5 years? The first thing you need to know is that most of the perpetrators of violence are between 15 and 25. Actually, it goes on through 30 and onwards. This is associated with everything from marriage to getting a job to brain development in males. The victims are also somewhat similar. The victims of everything except sexual assault are primarily males, and they're in the same age range. And this is actually Scottish data. We don't have it for Canada. And the purple one shows you for poor males, and the green shows you for poor females. Sorry, for rich males. The females are below that, and you can hardly see it. Although once you look at sexual assault, which is almost never reported to police for a lot of very good reasons, you are talking about almost exclusively females, not exclusively, but almost exclusively. So within those poor areas, about 5% of the young men living in those areas account for half the offenses. So the secrets to actually reducing violence are focusing on those young men before they get arrested, because they're the men who will eventually get arrested. And that arrest will do very little, but just we will have to pay if they get convicted and they get incarcerated. But incarceration just delays. If they're there for long enough and they age out, they will be less likely to be involved in the sorts of offenses they were involved in earlier on. But for most of them, prison just is like putting something in the fridge, and then you bring it out later. It just continues. We've been spending lots of money all over the world, well, all over the rich world, trying to rehabilitate these young men with very little success. So we have to focus on getting to those young men before they start getting arrested. So we're living in an age where you could actually go on a series of websites on your cell phone. So I'm going to show you a series of websites. The main impression I want you to get is that there are a lot of government websites that give us the answers to the question of what works to reduce violence within 5 years. So that's a police one. This is the US one. This is one on violence against women. This is WHO. This is one on cost effectiveness. This is WHO. So if you tried to go on these, you would be lost. So what I did in Science and Secrets, one whole section identifies what has been proven to work. So what you would get from the section in Science and Secrets, or you can now get from a British website called the Youth Endowment Fund, where they've invested 350 million Canadian dollars over 10 years for getting what works used. We don't have anything like that here, and the Americans don't either, but the Brits are ahead of us. So what you would find is that outreach is really important. My favorite program is called Youth Inclusion. Basically, in those poor areas, you have a couple of social workers with a place like the old fire station in Ottawa, just south of Carleton. We actually had a youth inclusion program in the city of Ottawa. And what you basically do is get the family mothers typically, or the school, or occasionally police, to identify people who are at risk of violence, who are probably already involved in violence. And the outreach worker, who's a person who would be trusted by the young men, outreaches to them. And you attract them into a place where they can play sports, they can get help with homework if they're in school, they can be mentored, and so on. And these were done in the UK across 70 poor areas. That's huge. And they got an overall 65 reduction in youth arrests before and after. That is better than 50%, and it occurred within a couple of years. You have to set up the program. I knew the first guy who ran the old Firehall Center, and he was previously a cop. He said, I worked in the market for 5 years, and in my first year running this, I stopped more crime than I could ever imagine from working in the market. Market is actually a high crime area, as you're probably aware. Another of my favorites is when somebody gets shot or knifed and they go to the civic or the general, you have one of these outreach workers there for them. The surgeons sew them up, and then the outreach worker works with them. These get about a 40% reduction in returns because many of these young men involved in violence come back quite quickly. So these are two relatively obvious things. The first one, by the way, is on the Public Safety Canada website. There are other things you can do. You can do cognitive behavioral training. The Canadian one is called SNAP, Stop Now and Plan. It gets about a 33% reduction with a return on investment of at least $15. You can say, well, it's not 50%, but 33% is a lot better than we're getting from policing. And if you combine these things, as I'll show you in a moment, you get even a better return on your investment. There are other cognitive behavioral programs, but SNAP, it was invented in Toronto, and they actually have a program to try and get investment so that you're getting enough of these programs to actually see overall reductions. Everybody talks about trauma. Undoubtedly, the people in the market today have had a lot of trauma in their lives before, and we are trying to somehow do something in terms of housing, in terms of arrests, little of which will make any difference. But trauma therapy gives you a return of about 45% reductions. It's not cheap, but when you look at the costs of policing or even the costs of housing, but particularly the costs of policing, it is certainly gives you a much better return. So I just want to flag parenting. It's a long-term game, but of course you reduce child abuse in the short term, but over the long term you reduce violence. So you can do some stuff with policing. You don't need more policing. You just need to be a lot smarter with your use of policing. The most important thing for policing is to promote the things that work, which the City of Ottawa Police do not do. They're not doing problem-solving policing, and they're not doing focused deterrence, which is basically a partnership where the police push the young men involved in violence to services. They are trying to do stuff with weapons, particularly guns. Alcohol, they don't really engage in, but they do on the margins. The health area needs to be doing a lot more. I think our public health doctor in Ottawa is just not aware of the knowledge. And once she's aware of the knowledge, I think she will start doing things. There's a very famous epidemiological analysis of victims of violence coming to hospital emergency rooms in Cardiff that got a 40% reduction within a year. Basically, you feed back the information if you've got an office for violence reduction. And hospitals are very important for measuring success because, as I mentioned, the victims do go to the police, but many more of them go to emergency rooms than go to the police. So this is a very important way of measuring success. So cost efficiency, it's a complicated table, but this comes from Public Safety Canada. Basically says invest in SNAP, that's the cognitive behavioral one, invest in the youth inclusion, and invest in a family treatment. You do this at the right time, and you will get about a reduction of about a third in costs of policing, which is an indicator for less violence. If you actually added in the cost to victims, then you get more than half in terms of cost benefit. So this is something Public Safety Canada, unfortunately, the people who know this are not high enough up in the hierarchy. You do not see around the table in Public Safety Canada a deputy minister responsible for prevention at the same level as the head of the RCMP or the head of corrections or the parole board. And this is just stupid. Until we do that, we should not expect violence reductions. So a little bit on how you actually make this stuff happen. First of all, at the UN in '85, we got a Magna Carta for victims. So victims matter. We need to stop them being victims. We need to get their rights. And then in 2015, and you will know 2015 because of the environmental stuff, but there is an SDG 5 that includes the reduction. It actually says the elimination of violence against girls, sexual violence and gender-based violence against women and girls. And then 16 talks about significant reductions in street violence and elimination of the violence against children. So yeah, Canada has agreed to these things. We are, of course, not doing these things. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we can maybe get them to do these things right. The key to getting violence reduction is diagnosis. So the city of Ottawa needs to have a look at its crime problems, come up with a business plan. A business plan means what they need to do, what it would cost, what the benefits would be, implement it and evaluate it. As a lot of you are numerate, evaluate involves measuring, the safety diagnosis involves measuring, the rest is using data that we have. But in order to do that, you have to have an office for violence reduction. It's called here a joint planning board and secretariat. This is absolutely key. And Ottawa shut down its office in 2023. Nobody knows quite why, but it was never doing the job. So it was there, but it didn't have the skills to do the job that we need. So we live in a province where in 2019, folk like me cheered because they changed the Police Act to a Community Safety and Police Act. So we made progress. And were you to read that act, and the city of Ottawa, not the police, the city of Ottawa is responsible for doing this. Section 251, and a lot of sections, but Section 251 is about community safety. It says identify risk factors contributing to crime, victimization, addiction, drug overdose, and actually suicide. You couldn't wish for more. Secondly, you've got to identify strategies. We couldn't wish for more, particularly when we have knowledge about those strategies. You've got to set out measurable outcomes. You couldn't wish for more. Of course, they're not doing it. They haven't got around to doing it. They tried to do something during COVID that, in my view, is a complete red herring, but hopefully that will change. There is a guide to those plans, and all I want you to notice is the red is what we're doing now, $25 billion and rising in Canada in response to crime, and that's just the cops, courts, and corrections. On the outside is the green. That means eliminating poverty and so on that you can't do in 3 years. You need to do it, but don't expect short-term results. The blue and the yellow are the short-term results. Those projects that I used as examples that work are in that blue zone. So has anybody actually done this? Yes. I'm going to spare you the history to Glasgow, except that the chief of detectives in Glasgow was at a meeting that I was at with the folk from Bogota, and he basically went home and adopted the Bogota model, but he didn't do it on his own. He brought in an epidemiologist, a nurse, public health analyst. They set up an office for violence reduction, really important office for violence reduction. It did the diagnosis. They did the things that the diagnosis called for, youth inclusion being one of them. They actually did some call-ins to push the young men into the youth inclusion. They had the emergency rooms, and they tracked results. They were measuring. You can't get a better example, and it got 50% reduction in homicides and violence within 3 years. It took them a couple of years to get going, but we can build on the shoulders of Glasgow. And that's what's happening. Across the UK, they are cloning Glasgow. And London is just one. They set up an office for violence reduction in 2019 in the city. It's not police-based at all. They've done youth mentoring to scale. They've got school completion. They're doing their cognitive behavioral program. Maybe as good as SNAP, I don't know, but I'm a fan of SNAP. So despite COVID, they have already got a 25% reduction in homicides, 15% knife injuries for people under 25. They use knives, not guns, and a 26% reduction in robberies. Robberies are theft with violence. So, hey, if they can do it, and if they can turn around a city that size that quickly, a little city like Ottawa should be able to do this and should be able to do it quickly. Now, Toronto is trying to do this. It actually has a community safety plan, and a part of that has spun all, well, not all, most mental health crises to mental health professionals. So they've already done something that takes policing out of this, which is really important, because people get hurt because the police don't actually know how to deal with mental health crises, and they often make it worse. So they're already on track, and Ottawa is copying that. So over the next couple of years, we will hopefully see fewer people in a mental health crisis injured by police. So their plan calls for reductions in both gender-based violence and street violence, and not just building more refuges for battered women. They're trying to get to the risk factors as required by the Act, but they haven't really got it going to scale. They've got some good things happening, but the new mayor of Toronto said she wants a public health approach, a scientific approach, what's worked in other places. We want to expand those that work, track results, and be inspired by Glasgow. And she said that after the woman was shot outside the safe injection site in Toronto. So it was a dramatic incident. And she came out and said very clearly, the solutions are to tackle the risk factors, to measure, to track results, and to do what Glasgow said. And they have an office for violence reduction that hasn't really been announced, that is part of their community safety group. I'm not quite sure what it's going to look like, but Toronto Housing, which is where most of the offenders and many of the victims come from in Toronto, has an office for violence reduction with a manager, and he actually has the skills to do the planning. So we'll see what he can pull off. He's new. So, sorry. So now to the bottom line. I'm going to come around to that first slide. So some of what I've done with this particular book is I've got this book into the offices of politicians, officials. I think there are 4 city councillors in Ottawa who have a copy, and I think I only gave a copy to 1. So some of them have, I assume, bought it or got it from somebody in their area. People in the Ministry of Child Development in Toronto at the political level have copies of the book that they got. There's a an MPP backbencher who has been, I'm not sure whether she succeeded trying to get some of these projects into the budget. She has a copy of the book. I've also done a TEDx talk that is quite old. My son, who's into e-marketing, wants me to do a more up-to-date one. I've had quite an influence over the UN Office for Drugs and Crime and Habitat, so their next meetings are giving a big priority to both those violence reduction offices and to evidence-based prevention. And Canada goes to those meetings, they send officials, and those officials come back hopefully inspired. We did a petition. I'm not sure. We're thinking about doing a new petition and getting, we're inviting somebody from the main political parties to reread it. We're looking at doing a relaunch in the Senate because the launch originally was done before COVID. We've also helped the Canadian Centre for Safer Communities develop action briefs. These are 4 pages for decision makers. This is just one. They give an executive summary that they can read on their cell phone. It includes specific actions they can take, and then they can get their staff to read the next 3 pages that provide the, if you like, the academic support for what's put there. We've also done a series of op-eds. These are the ones in English. We've done a number in French too. These are the ones done for the Citizen and the Star. And these, of course, get a lot of exposure. You don't really know who's reading them. But importantly, the Star editorial board is reading them because they've done editorials basically plagiarizing our stuff. And they've also done a major article about Glasgow. And without giving away too many secrets, I get contacted by a lot of journalists, and I go out of my way to help them get prizes, help them get information. And the one on Glasgow was the result of one of those efforts. And I think you need to be working with journalism students from Carleton, because once they've got your stuff, they use it later on. And they come back to you for story ideas. They may use other people for the interviews. I'm not particularly wanting to be quoted, but I am wanting the stories to get out there and get out there repeatedly. So this is a list of some of the things that you probably don't have the time or energy to do, but you might. You can meet with city councillors. I've done presentations to folk like you in Ottawa and said, well, you need to get to your city councillor. People come up and they buy the book and say, yes, we're going to meet with a city councillor. You can also meet with your provincial member of parliament and your federal member of parliament. Yasser Naqvi, by the way, was influential in the change to the Police Act. I'm not sure that he's actually done much about it, but I think he knows this file. So I put in here journalism students. You can write letters. You don't have to write op-eds. You can delegate. Don't bother about the Police Services Board. They won't listen to you, and you have to write a 3-minute. You're not into that, but you can do something with the committee of the city that deals with the planning. And there are other things you can do. So we've developed a series of community safety monitor tools. We actually developed these for Habitat, but we're wanting to see them used in UN Habitat as the UN agency for cities. They have a Safer Cities program, and Canada is involved in that program. Funding actually comes from Germany, but anyhow, Canada is involved. So this actually is a sort of short list of things that tackle risk factors. I mentioned most of those earlier. Number 6 is really important because Stephanie Plant who has a difficult area in terms of crime. She's proposing solutions that are well known not to work. Sutcliffe is, of course, proposing well-known solutions that don't work. I'm not interested in fighting Sutcliffe on whether he's going to have more police in the market or already has police all over the place. If he wants to do that, he can do that. What's important is that we actually do the things that will reduce the problems there, and police are not a key player in that. There are things the police can do. I actually think what they can do about traffic is probably the most important. They can also divert. They can help people link up with outreach services, but you have to fund the outreach services first. And you don't need more money. The police have more than enough people to do these things if they wanted to, as has been demonstrated in other countries. The Brits actually cut back policing levels by 20%, and you can't see any impact on crime. In London, they're bringing back, in the City of London, the mayor is bringing back the number of police, but not to more than it was before, and while he is also investing in the things that will actually reduce violence. So this is a bit more complicated, but this is what cities and governments have to do. It says cities here. So Ottawa needs an office for violence prevention. They need to do that diagnosis. They need to either have somebody who knows how to do it, or they need to hire the Canadian Centre for Safer Communities like Gatineau is doing, like Regina is doing. Actually, many of the people who work for the Canadian Centre for Safer Cities actually live in the National Capital Region. So, you have these incredible stupidities, but eventually it will get through to somebody and they will start doing it, and Ottawa will start catching up with Toronto or Regina or Victoria or the province of Manitoba. So measurement is really important in all this. It's quite a complicated slide. As I mentioned earlier, you need to measure police data, but not only police data, you need hospital data. You also need to measure 911 calls, because the main propaganda used by the police unions is if crime's going up, then we need more cops to respond to 911 calls. Well, this is stupid. You need to reduce the number of 911 calls by reducing the violence that leads to the 911 calls. And maybe you need to increase policing a little bit in the short term, although I don't buy that argument. But you certainly need to be doing the things that will reduce it. And of course, what gets measured gets treasured. So you need to be measuring these things. So there's the beginning slide. You need to be looking at how you articulate your message in a way that is persuasive to decision makers. You need to have skilled people working in the background. The York University Environmental Studies there may be other places, but it's certainly the longest standing. And, the University of Ottawa, Carleton, should have a program that is not just about environmental science, it's about how you get environmental science used. And even though there's a criminology program at the University of Ottawa, they're not actually teaching people how to get it used. And yes, and people in communications may be learning communications, but you need to put this together. You need to raise awareness. The UN is really important in slow, but it's a marathon, a gradual shift. And you need to involve e-marketers who are basically young people who know how to use Instagram and Twitter, and these are cheap. And we've actually produced in our area the things that they can use, like that 2-minute video. And if you have money, you can be able to do a better video than ours, because ours didn't have a budget. Yeah, we need to work with journalists, and you need to get those courses changed. And you need to look at organizations. There seem to be a lot of organizations working on environmental issues. You need to work with them to make sure that they're informed. You need to partner with them. You need to help get task forces, and you need to help get the lobby groups that can make the change. So I think my 45 minutes are up. So it's over to you to disagree, to challenge, to ask questions, whatever you want. I'm going to shut the slideshow down, but I will be able to answer any questions you have from the slideshow or from what I've said.
Okay, well, thank you, Irvin. We have 4 people that have questions in order. It's Art Hunter, Jean Doherty, Ted Manning, and I will probably have one before it's time to quit too. So that, Art, why don't you ask your question? And then Jean, you're on deck.
Yes, I'm was intrigued by your comment that am I coming through on this, Phil?
I can hear you.
Okay, I was intrigued by your
Yes.
comment that said that climate crime was in fact identified, and I'm kind of interested in knowing how do you get attribution that says that climate change was certainly a mitigating factor, and is that indeed growing? I suspect it is, and a little bit of disclosure as well. I am just starting off being a member of the Manotick Village Community Association, and I'm not quite sure what they have done to date with regards to violent crime, but I am also very interested in knowing what a community can do and an individual can do in a plan to survive, particularly from climate crime as it grows in magnitude. I noticed that you did mention that there are some action briefs, and I'm just wondering if there's any of those that are available that I could take forward to my community association, and clearly the what happens in downtown Ottawa doesn't affect us out in the regions away from the core, and we've got to have some action plan in place as well. I'd be interested in some of your comments that says how can we do this. There's about 5 questions there, and I'm looking for help. I'm reaching out for help.
Okay, in your question, you sometimes called it climate crime and sometimes violent crime. I just want to clarify that I was only talking about violent crime. So basically where somebody hits you, knives you, shoots you, or otherwise hurts you. So the short answer is those action briefs are available in English and French for free download from the website is called safercities.ca. You can look it up as the Canadian Centre for Safer Communities, and then you look for action briefs and you would find it. You'll find quite a lot of action briefs. If you look at the ones from 2018, point 1, that's the one that I showed you there. I think you would actually find the op-eds as useful as the action briefs, but you might want to have you can read the action brief, you would understand what it says. You would certainly be able to read the op-ed and know what it says. You would also be able to use the TEDx if you wanted to. That's 14 minutes. In relation to, I think what you need to do is to meet with your city councillor and basically say, you heard my presentation. You can show him my presentation if he's got 40 or she's got 45 minutes. and then ask them to talk to, there's a group in the city of Ottawa working on the community safety wellbeing plan. And I think what you should do is ask the city councillor to talk to them. Almost certainly your city councillor isn't aware that they're doing it. And even if they're aware, they haven't talked. And to see what that group tells you in relation to the concerns in your area. So that's, I think, the politically smart way to go. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. You could ask your city councillor to get the Canadian Centre for Safer Communities to do a presentation to the community safety group working in City Hall, and that your group and others could attend. So you're not the only group asking questions about how to influence. And if you had them come in and you then say, well, we're concerned about whatever you're concerned about, break-ins or car theft or something, they can then address that specifically. I'm not really interested in doing it because I'm getting old. And I think it's more important to work with younger people because they can follow through. They have energy to do things and to follow through.
Okay, you've said a lot, and I will listen to all this again. I've made a bunch of notes, and I thank you very much.
So just a quick question from me, and it goes back to the beginning of your experience at promoting your thoughts, Irvin. Did you have something special that would gain access to these decision makers? Was it did you have a specific training in the subject area, or did you just have good luck at being the first in line because there was nobody else having the same message?
So I went to the Institute of Criminology at the University of Cambridge, and it was basically a master's degree, but not like we have them here. You actually only learned the things you needed, and it was all packaged together. And the guy who set that up was about influencing policy. So that sort of energized me. My first book was about the failure of prisons, and I was on a major task force. So I saw the influence of a task force on changing policy. And then I worked in government for 8 years with Trudeau on the abolition of the death penalty, gun control, violence against women. And I saw how you could influence. If you actually look at what's called the peace and security package, that came directly, it came directly from a book that I wrote about victims. So it was very victim oriented. How are we going to remove the death penalty and convince Canadians that they're going to be safe? And I saw how it worked, and I got a UN General Assembly resolution through, and I've worked with governments all over the world, including the Alberta government in the year 2000. I know that you can make change, and I think the key to making change is that you have to somehow communicate with the decision makers and give them an offer that they can't refuse. They will refuse part of it, but if they take on any of it, then you're winning. And it is a marathon, and I have seen it's a domino thing. You move here in South Australia, and then you move here in Scotland, and then you move here, and it's actually a very exciting year for me because I mentioned that the Brits have cloned Glasgow. What I didn't tell you is that they're evaluating all the clones. So you don't just know that it worked in London, you know that it worked in Manchester, and you know it worked because they reduced the police data, but they also reduce the number of injuries. And when they're evaluating, then there's proof that it works. So you not only have Glasgow, but you now have most of a country that is winning. And then you only have to look south of the border. So Biden has appointed Kamala Harris. I actually know, I don't know them personally, but I know Biden and Harris over quite a long time because I've been involved in US organizations. And Kamala Harris was the chief prosecutor in San Francisco and then the attorney general for California before running for the Senate. And she actually has a book called Smart on Crime. I have a book called Smarter Crime Control that's better, but you know, if you're the politician and you've written the book and there's no competition. She is now the head of the gun violence prevention for the White House. And they have hired one of the main gun people, a gun lobbyist, an anti-gun lobbyist, and one of the people dealing with the outreach stuff. It's called Cure Violence in the States. And they are funding offices for violence prevention in US states. So Maryland just passed a legislation to set up an office for violence prevention. You also have Boston, where the mayor of Boston has promised a 20% reduction in shootings and homicide in the next 3 years. Well, if I was the mayor of Boston, that's what I would promise, because I know I can achieve a lot more. So there really is a movement, and the movement in Canada is typically very low key, but it's happening. And we will just have to see what Ford is going to do, what the Ford budget does, and what the Ford budget does next year. I mean, he has daughters who are police officers, so he's not going to give up on policing. But I don't want to fight policing. I want to fight for the things that will reduce the need for policing. That's a very important distinction, because I'm basically on the sides of potential victims and taxpayers.
Okay, well, thank you. Jean, I'm going to pass it over to you. I'm going to have to absent myself for a couple of minutes. I have to go and get the plug-in for my computer or else it's going to die. So anyway, Jean, if you can carry your question, and I'll be back briefly.
All right. And Ted, I see as you're ready to go for the next question. Irvin, this has been a really, really interesting talk, a lot of information that you've given, and I can see a lot of direct linkages when it comes to the issues associated with climate change and violence in the work that you're doing. But I'm going to step back a little bit and ask a question about the success that you've been able to get in going into and talking to the powers that be, whether it be a city councillor or a member of parliament or anybody else, because the problem that I see is happening with the climate change and the environmental polycrisis that we're facing right now is the fact that we are having a lot of difficulty, not just convincing people, but to get the powers that be to understand that, Houston, we have a problem and we have to start acting now. And you mentioned a few things, like you talk about it being cost effective. Well, we've tried to do that, and they still deny the fact that it's a problem. You start looking at provinces like Alberta and you go, oh my goodness, what is going on in that place? So how can we get, in our way of trying to do activism, how can we be more successful in getting into and talking to and getting the policies and changes in place that we need?
So I think it helps to have a champion who invites you in. And so we have Guibault, and who knows who will get next. And I assume you're focused more on Ontario and the city of Ottawa than the rest of the country. But in Ottawa, you have Sean Menard as the chair of the Environment Committee. It's nice to be invited in, but you can't always count on being invited in. And many of the changes that I've seen have happened without being invited in. And this is why insiders are so important. So Blair, I think, is on the call. So the Mike, who is a Unitarian who works for the city, working with him, I think they have 2 or 3 people who actually know about environmental things, which is not true of crime. So I think working with them, supporting them, delegating is really important. It's a horrible word, but going to committees and making your case. You probably have 5 minutes to make your case. And linking up with finding a journalist who will cover your story. I don't know how familiar you are with social media, but a lot of these committees are now being streamed. I don't know who streams the environmental committee, but when they're streamed, they at least go to the people who are believers or who would like to be believers. I don't know how you can work with cafes, these sort of people I'm on the margin with. But I think you need to get somebody, I haven't seen all the faces, but I suspect that you do not have somebody who is totally comfortable with Instagram or Twitter or LinkedIn, and maybe there are others that can be used. So you need to get somebody, you might be able to get a student placement to help you, or a son or a daughter to help you. And maybe I'm maligning you that you have lots of young people, but you need to get people who are at ease with this stuff and know how to use it. And yeah, so I've mentioned collaborating, I've mentioned social media, and you need to, maybe you do have your case very succinctly. These action briefs are succinct. That, if I had money, I could improve that 2-minute video. But we did a video like that for the UN that's in English, French, and Spanish that is done with Canva. And if you have somebody who's under 30 working with you, they can do a Canva video. So you can go with a 1 or 2-minute message to a parliamentary committee, to Queen's Park, to Ottawa with a video that has your main message, and you say the message is there. And I haven't really seen the other environmental groups using this. I mean, cafes, I just follow on the side of my desk. They don't seem to really be using social media. And you need to, in the long term, go to the journalism school and say that you have a message that you think would interest one of their students. And they'll send you a 3rd-year student, their assignment, and they will cover your stuff for the rest of their career.
Very
Okay, well,
good
thank you.
suggestions. Thank you very much, Irvin. I like that.
Yeah, so that approaching the School of Journalism at Carleton has been one of the things on my list. So maybe we can act on that. Ted, can you now have your question? And John
Yes, certainly,
Collins has
Irvin,
a comment after that.
That was very intriguing and very familiar, because quite frankly, those of us trying to fight politics in an environment are running into very much the same issues. I'm not sure if you have advice for us, because of late, certainly at the provincial and higher levels, the environment has become immensely politicized to the point where people are taking sides, and trying to really get in front of them at all is almost a fight. In some ways, to coin a phrase, we consider what's happening now virtually criminal, and therefore we probably need your help. But the real issue is trying to get the political literati to actually consider something that is more long-term, as you have with your crime statistics and work. We're finding that in politics, it's very immediate. If there's a big problem this week, somebody, for example, truckers driving through your streets or a flood coming through your community, they are interested, and then it goes away very quickly. And trying to get people to not just overreact, but actually try to anticipate and prevent is very difficult. So in some ways, I'm asking for your help for us to try and deal with that area.
Well, I don't think I have the silver bullet to use the phrase. My gut reaction is that you need to be putting forward positive solutions.
Mm-hmm.
So let me just, in the area I know,
Mm-hmm.
so this is a political split.
Mm-hmm.
So Poilievre wants to increase penalties.
Mm-hmm.
He hasn't really talked about the police, but he's really copying an American solution that clearly doesn't work. You know, if you've got the Oscar for the highest level of incarceration in the world, and you've got the Oscar amongst rich countries for the highest homicide of the rate, this is not a solution. I choose as much as possible not to fight propaganda, because the police unions are very good at it. Probably haven't heard that expression, but they basically, at the time of municipal elections, because that's where they can have the most influence, they come in and tell you, well, if you don't increase the police budget, you're going to be knifed in a telephone booth tomorrow. So I tend to stay away from trying to correct that and trying to push positive things that can be done.
Just a
And
quick follow-up to that. How open are politicians to success stories from other cultures and other countries? Have you found that Glasgow resonates, or do they just think of it somewhere else?
I think Glasgow is resonating in Canada. I don't think it's resonating in the US, because the US, of course, knows they know. But Glasgow is resonating across the rest of the world, and certainly in Canada. So the mayor of Toronto talks about being inspired by Glasgow. And I find that in both English and French, when you use Glasgow, people know roughly what you mean. You mean that there was some action taken that reduced violence quickly. They may not have got that there was an office to do it. They know that they used evidence-based stuff, and they know that some of this was helping you. So I think it does resonate. And unfortunately, there aren't. So I do a lot of work in Spanish and Latin America, and I use Glasgow, but I also use Bogota for obvious reasons. I use Medellin. I use a place called Coahuila in Mexico. I use Palmyra. So there are actually more examples in Latin America. And I'm actually part of a group in Latin America that meets once a year, and I get invited to repeat the same message, which is a sort of similar message to the one I presented to you, but the information is from Latin America. It would be nice to get more examples, and I just hope Toronto with Chow will actually follow through, because I think it will be checkmate if she does. Plant in Montreal is a bit harder. She's been increasing policing for some reason, but she now talks, even on auto theft, she's now talking about prevention. And there are certainly other mayors who are interested. And so this is also a possible hint for you. So the Big City Mayors Caucus. So I actually worked quite a bit with FCM in the 90s, Federation of Canadian Municipalities. But they are relatively powerless. The big city mayors are very powerful.
Right.
So that's whatever, 20-something big city mayors, including Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, etc. And I think working with them will have influence not just on the Trudeau government, but if the Conservatives come to power, it will have influence there. I don't know quite so much about the Ontario Municipal Association, but I think they're important to work with. And yeah.
Thank you very much. That was most learningful experience, I would say. Thank you.
Okay, so Irvin, I have a comment here from one of our members who's not with us anymore, but she says, I can get you an interview on CKCU. Is that something that you would be interested in with your subject matter?
I'll talk to any journalist who is, I'll actually talk to any journalist. So if she wants it, if CKCU would be interested, I think the most interesting folk to be interviewed by are CFRA, because they tend to be a little bit more on the right. CBC is always interesting, the Globe, Star. The Citizen is also interesting because they're also basically on the right. And my message resonates with people on the right. They want less crime. And yeah, they think policing and punishment is the way to go, but they listen to somebody saying it isn't the way to go. And they also listen to what the real solutions are. Harper actually increased the money for crime prevention. They just didn't spend it.
Okay, so I'm going to ask John Hollins to have his say, and then Raymond Lurie, if you want to articulate your comment, you've got time.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking Phil Riley for inviting you and you accepting his invitation. We in Cacor cover an enormous range of disciplines with our membership. And we have quite a few people who are really knowledgeable about the science of global heating and its consequences. But we're barely in the kindergarten of advocacy. So what you've done for me today, and I think for many others, is give us a really clear, some really straightforward, simple ideas. So I thank you for that. You've actually already answered, in answering Jean Doherty, you've actually already answered the question that I had, which was, how did you launch your e-marketing? And one of the things, we're an association of people, not all as old as me, but we're mostly retired folks, well above 60, 55 and up. Your remarks about how do we connect with the School of Journalism at Carleton, and any other tips in enabling us to at least get into the first grade of advocacy?
Well, the voices on that 2-minute video are two young people who actually worked with me on the text for the action briefs for the Canadian Centre for Safer Communities. And we continue to work. And one is finishing a PhD at Carleton this year. And the other is works for the Canadian Centre for Safer Community, and she's a real star. And they can produce Instagram for you. The guy uses Twitter quite a bit, and and he's also an activist. He does delegations in the city of Ottawa, so he's going out and doing things. Those op-eds were jointly written, so that gets their name out. I don't need my name out, so they were always the first author of those. So the woman is actually a francophone. You wouldn't know it listening to her. So I wrote the op-eds in French with her, and I wrote the op-eds in English with him. So you need to get there, I don't know, around 30. But you need to get somebody who is interested in what you're doing. It doesn't necessarily know the science to the sophisticated level that most of your people, and they will help you. I think there's some very easy things to know about Twitter in order to be successful with it. But if you can get somebody who already knows those things, that would be better. I don't know, but you could maybe talk to the Department of Communications at U Ottawa, and maybe the same if they have one at Carleton, and see if they would like to have a placement student work with you to get your message out. But ultimately, you need to find somebody. Well, I'm not sure how much money you have, but if you are able to hire somebody, but please be careful who you hire. You need to hire somebody who is who's going to be good at these things, but who wants the experience trying to get your message across. So it could be an older person, meaning I have sons who are in their late 30s, and the problem is they have small kids, but they like to earn well, one of them likes to earn money and do good things on the side. So if you can find somebody who's earning money and wants to do good things on the side and has time, that's what you really want, who can do good things with you.
Cacor has been basically a modest think tank in its 50 year. We're celebrating our 50th year in a few months, and never needed to spend much money doing that. And so it's a fairly difficult transition to get an annual general meeting to agree to increase its income. This community doesn't really understand that it needs to spend money. So our move into some effective advocacy starts with a struggle chez nous. But all the things you've said have been most helpful. Thank you very much.
So the 2-minute video, there was no budget.
Oh, we have a member whose origin is in India. Origins are in India, and who currently resides in Spain, much younger than most of the rest of us, the crowd on this call. And he's made several very good short videos for us. So at this stage, we have some material that we could launch if we started using e-marketing.
And don't shy away from a TEDx.
How does one get onto TEDx?
Well, it's nice when you get invited without knowing, but you basically go on their website and you look at what you have to do, and you look for a place that is organizing a TEDx series. So my TEDx was done at the University of Ottawa, so that was easy. They had a license. I'm not sure if they still do, but you'll have to look and see what's coming up, and then you would need to pitch what you're proposing. Another I'm not sure whether you have any academics on your list, but another way of getting the message out is called The Conversation. It's an 800-word thing that goes out, and it's basically, they help you draft something that the media would like, and then the media does like it. But I mean, TEDx, lots and lots of people watch TED Talks or TEDx talks.
I'm one of them.
Okay, well, if I'm correct, we should be wrapping up pretty soon, but I want to give Raymond a chance to have his comment heard, and then we'll see what happens after that. So,
Okay,
Art, could
thanks,
you
Phil.
confirm whether we have to shut down pretty soon?
Yeah, we're coming to the end. Go ahead, Raymond.
Okay, so thank you very much, Irvin. Lots of interesting information. I made a comment earlier with respect to the committee meetings at Ottawa City Hall. So there is a YouTube channel where they stream it live, and they also record them, so you could go and watch them after they've occurred. So that's a good source. I use that all the time for the stuff I do with City Hall. But I did have one quick question. You showed the graph where violent crime started increasing somewhere around 2018, I believe it is. And I know the pandemic might have had some influence there at the later part of your graph, but is there something that you could point to that would have been government measures that might have affected that?
The short answer is no. It's actually 2014, 2015 when it started increasing again. I don't know the real impact of fentanyl on those statistics. So it's violent crime. So it's not really determined by homicide, but homicide has followed the same trend. And if I was explaining the homicide, I would certainly be including the retailers of drugs, so shooting each other, so-called gangs. But I'm waiting for somebody to do a PhD thesis on that. It certainly has nothing to do with government policy. They have not changed any policy that would have an impact like that. And COVID, so COVID in Canada actually reduced violent crime a little bit. COVID in the United States sent homicide through the roof. It went up by 30 or 40%, depending on the city. It's come off a little bit from that. It's hard to see what the impact of COVID would be. COVID almost certainly has had an impact on gender-based violence, but we can't really measure it because nobody does in Canada does the surveys. All we know is that more people were wanting to go to transition houses where they could live separate from their husband. You know, that you basically, our policy is that the woman and her kids and the dog all have to leave the house and the guy stays in the house. And you don't want to do that. So, but with COVID, more people wanted to do that. So I don't know.
Okay.
But there is also very clearly, you probably have somebody who knows more about income distribution. So the reason why crime went down a bit in Canada, I do have a theory for, and that is CERB. So if you pay people a minimum income, you would expect both street and property, both street violence and property crime to go down. So US cities where they've paid people if they don't get arrested, those cities have reduced homicide significantly. And so that's probably what happened here and didn't happen in the US.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Irvin. I think that it's time for Ted Manning to give his official thank you on the organization's behalf for providing us with your background history and some good ideas on moving forward. Over you, Ted.
Yeah, thank you very much, Irvin. That was very interesting for us. It's really, I think, intriguing to learn that other sectors and other issues tend to have very much the same kinds of concerns. And thank you very much for the help you've been giving us in terms of the ideas of how to communicate. If Art's on at the end of this, Art can tell us very much how much we're getting out, because we're now on YouTube fairly extensively with almost every one of these presentations going out, yours included. And we get into the hundreds and thousands of watches. And this also may be a better way for us to begin to expand our influence. Anyway, I would thank you again for coming, and we hope to have you again with better news in a year or two when you tell us how well it has really worked after all these evaluations come in and we can find out what is effective. So thank you again.
Thank you for the invitation. Good luck.
Okay. Now we have the commercial. Essentially, we are encouraging everyone who does not belong, please make sure the dues are due now for those of you who have not paid yet this year. And we are also encouraging people, if you go on to see the YouTubes, please log in, let them know that you in fact approve, and we can go on with the notion that if you are subscribed people, we actually get to count as well as the actual ones on there. So thank you again. So we would now say we are about to turn the recording off. So your moment this says we're done, we are free then to come on. Thank you. And so it's now wide open. You're welcome to put on your screen and your mic and talk to each other.